Today we'll start talking about how, according to academician Fomenko, history actually developed. It began in the 11th century. In the 11th century, Christ was crucified, but we'll get to that a bit later. I'm getting messages too, and I'd like to reply to some of your letters right now. For example, someone wrote, "To all the viewers, this includes myself, dear host, please keep in mind that this conversation with Mr. Podoynitsyn is purely a commercial promotion of the new chronology. It doesn't even remotely smell like science." To the host, Andrei Maksimov, "You're an ignoramus and a scoundrel because you're afraid to criticize your guest on air, or maybe you're just not being paid for it." Well, first of all, I must tell you that academician Fomenko is a professor at Moscow State University, and second, he has no way of paying me. That's clear enough. A scientist doesn't buy airtime, however impossible that may sound to you. These broadcasts are completely free. Moreover, the initiative for them and the idea itself came from the TV company, Authors Television. I found Andrei, not the other way around, because I thought it would be really interesting to talk about this subject. Why did I think so? A girl named Olga wrote something wonderful. Please continue to shed light on such an interesting problem. Isn't it true that life is dull and gray, and we sometimes lack bright flashes of color? I'm very grateful to Olga for that letter, because for me, this is also a bright flash. For me, and I've said this before, it's a completely fascinating exercise of the mind. As for those who say that academician Fomenko is destroying everything, which I hear often, I've thought about that. Probably, a long time ago, in the Stone Age, when a man first drew something on a rock, I'm sure they immediately killed him. Because his fellow tribesmen said, "We lived just fine without cave paintings. Why are you drawing? We lived without Galileo. We thought the earth stood still. We lived, everything was fine. We lived without Fomenko. Why do we need Fomenko? We lived perfectly well without him." That's how any new idea begins. We'll keep talking about this. We've got all sorts of ideas on the subject. Today we'll also tell you how to get cassettes with recordings of our conversations. As for the questions about our phone calls being fake, I can't really prove otherwise, except to give you my honest word that our broadcast is completely live and our calls are absolutely real. Now, we'll ask you an interactive question that Andrei and I came up with. I was tempted to ask, do you think I'll get a Taffy Award tomorrow? But I don't take those awards too seriously. And the question I really want to ask is quite serious. Do you think that in 21st century history textbooks, our time will be called the time of troubles? Call 8-tone-80-95-75-7531. The time of Russia's revival. Call 8-tone-80-95-75-7532. Or the time of boredom and despair. Call 8-tone-80-95-75-75-3533. We think it's an interesting poll that will reveal a lot. I believe it will be very useful to academician Fomenko in his work on the textbook you'll be hearing about. Before we move on to Christ, let's start with a question we already have.
To keep it short, in the previous broadcast, you said that the works of Homer belong somewhere in the Middle Ages, right? But at the same time, you date Christ to the 11th century. How then does the later spread of Christianity correspond to the presence in Homer's works of what we call ancient gods? That is, paganism. Thank you.
Thank you for the question. This one gets a bit ahead of the story we were planning to tell about how, in our group's view, history actually unfolded. Nevertheless, here's what can be said. Around the 13th century, Christianity, which up to that point had been a single, monolithic religion with minimal deviations, begins to split. Within Christianity, major differences appear. In the East, a more ascetic, restrained form of Christianity remains, while in the West, on the contrary, significant deviations emerge, in our view reaching the point of a de facto polytheism and the creation of a pantheon of gods. Those we know today as the ancient gods. I should say right away that this isn't the only point of view. There are researchers who believe that the pantheon of ancient gods, Zeus, Poseidon, Hera, and so on, is a relapse of pre-Christian beliefs. Our group adheres to the first view.
Now, the question about Christ has already been asked many times, so let's move on to the 11th century. So, in your opinion, our history and the Common Era begin in the 11th century?
I'd like to make one general remark. The fact is, as we've already said, in the early 17th century and then in the 18th, history underwent a radical reconstruction. It was largely rewritten. In particular, all major works were altered and rewritten anew. The originals, it seems, were destroyed. But a great many details survived: artworks, architectural monuments, inconsistencies in documents, and so on, which, in our opinion, still allow us to reconstruct the real picture. However, since we're dealing with fragments, debris, and scattered information, we constantly make reservations. When we talk about reconstructing history, we are speaking only of our hypotheses.
Yes, we've talked about that many times. Before you start talking about Christ, it's interesting that almost no one considers our time to be one of boredom and despair. The time of troubles and revival options are running close. Time of troubles has 32 votes so far, and revival has 23.
That's very telling.
Let's see which one wins. Interesting. Maybe revival will come out on top.
That would be great.
Sorry for interrupting.
That's what we'll focus on. In other words, we in no way claim to possess any absolute truth. The beginning of recorded history should be dated to the 10th–11th centuries. As for everything that happened before that, it's very difficult to make any judgments. The only thing we can say is that the archaeological finds we have, stone axes, needles, pottery fragments, primitive ornaments made from animal bones, characterize the period before the 11th century. That's a typical Stone Age.
What happened in the 11th century?
In the 11th century, the most important event took place: the coming of Jesus Christ, his life, and his crucifixion.
Where did this happen? Where did he come to?
A small remark. Apparently, as we believe today, the very first state was located on the territory of what is now Egypt. We conditionally call it the first ancient Rome, with its center in Alexandria. Only the most fragmentary and vague information about it has survived. At this point, we're not even ready to say anything substantial. In the 11th century, the capital was moved to the city we know under the names Constantinople, Istanbul, or Tsargrad. This is Byzantium. Among other things, according to our reconstruction, this same city was referred to in various documents and chronicles as Troy. In particular, when describing Troy and the Trojan War, in our view, Homer was actually talking about the city of Constantinople, or modern-day Istanbul.
Homer was describing Constantinople of what period?
It apparently refers to Constantinople of the 13th century. We'll get to that in a moment. The coming of Jesus Christ. We've already mentioned that according to astronomical datings, church tradition, and the Gospels, the dates of his birth, life, and death fall in the 11th century. Most likely, the year 0 should be considered 1053 or 1054. That's the famous Star of Bethlehem, which we tend to identify with the explosion of a supernova, at whose location we now see the Crab Nebula. Someone pointed out to us online that the dating of the Star of Bethlehem supposedly appears only in Chinese chronicles. But that's not quite true. The Crab Nebula is expanding. This can be measured. Accordingly, the rate of expansion can be extrapolated backward in time, which has been done. The result points to the 11th century. That's what astrophysicists claim.
Let's pause, take a call, and then continue.
Good evening. I have a question for Andrei. In the Indian capital, Delhi, there's an ancient temple called Qutb Minar. On its grounds stands a metal pillar that we read about in our 5th grade history textbook.
The Iron Pillar of Delhi.
Supposedly iron, pure iron. It's been analyzed by chemists and physicists, and it's said to be of non-terrestrial origin. Historians believe it's 10,000 years old. People hug it with their backs for love and good luck.
What's your question?
How does this pillar fit with the new chronology? I think you'll be able to answer that.
We haven't yet correlated this particular pillar with the chronology. Generally speaking, when it comes to specific archaeological structures or finds, the approach should always be the same. Whenever possible, and if resources allow, including financial ones, send scientists to the site who are ready to conduct an independent, truly independent physical, chemical, biological, or other type of examination of the given artifact or object. As for this pillar, a few words. It's indeed a famous structure. As far as I know, there's no unified point of view about it. Opinions range from the extraterrestrial hypothesis to, on the contrary, the most mundane version, that there's nothing extraordinary about the pillar at all. It's said to be a known type of iron of a certain purity that, supposedly, was already being smelted in the Middle Ages.
It's clear that, according to your chronology, the dates are shifted. But did the events happen? Was there a Calvary? All those stories, was there a Last Supper, and so on?
As for Calvary, I'd like to remind you that near the modern city known today as Jerusalem, there is also a site shown as Calvary, so to speak, as a visual aid. I think many of our viewers have visited Israel and have been to that place. They probably remember that Calvary shown today is, in fact, just a small hill, something you could find almost anywhere. Meanwhile, near Istanbul, on the opposite side of the strait, there exists a place that could very likely be reliably identified as the biblical Mount Calvary. It's the highest point on the Bosporus, Mount Beykoz. Since many of our citizens regularly visit Turkey and Istanbul, I can only suggest that on your next trip, you go to this mountain. You just need to tell the taxi driver to take you to the tomb of Yusha. Traditionally, historians believe that this Turkish name, Yusha, is a local pronunciation of Jesus. But historians also add that according to one version, this is the tomb of Joshua, son of Nun.
I want to understand this correctly. Do people living in Istanbul believe that Christ's tomb is there? Since they call him Yusha, and so on?
No. As far as we know, all native residents of Istanbul, the Turks, are well aware that this is the tomb of Yusha, the tomb of Jesus. But naturally, no direct parallels are drawn today. However, according to our reconstruction, the so-called tomb of Yusha is most likely not a burial site, but an execution site. There exists an ancient Old Russian text called the Pilgrimage of Abbot Daniel, who visited Jerusalem at the site of Christ's crucifixion. It contains a fairly detailed description of the place of execution. What we see today at the so-called tomb of Yusha remarkably corresponds to what is described in that ancient text: the layout of stones, the location of the spear, and other features.
Let's take another call.
Hello, good evening. I have a question. Does it mean that the Crusades took place while Christ was still alive? That's the first question. And second, who were they fighting, if, according to the new chronology, Muslims appeared only in the 16th century? Thank you.
Vasily, thank you very much. Your question lets me both answer and smoothly continue the story. Information about the 12th century is extremely vague. Apparently, it was quite a peaceful time, with few wars, and it wasn't well reflected in documents, let alone in later interpretations. One thing can be said with some confidence. The state religion of the Empire of the Romans, as we call it to distinguish it from the traditional ancient Roman Empire, was Christianity. The recognized religious center was Constantinople, Troy, Jerusalem, and the regions we know today as Germany, Italy, France, modern Egypt, and Russia were provinces, themes, of this empire of the Romans. These provinces retained a fair degree of autonomy, and their vassal dependence most likely took the form of tribute payments. Each province was headed by its own prince, king, or first, as they might have been called. It was in the 13th century that major tectonic shifts began. The center of the empire of the Romans weakened, and as the provinces developed, they began to exert influence on the center. In particular, the East, which at the time, as now, included Russia, became significantly stronger. The center found itself forced to pursue a more Eastern-oriented policy. That is, Constantinople Tsargrad was not yet conquered, but it had already come under the influence of the East.
So, who fought whom in the Crusades?
The next part directly concerns them. Naturally, this situation could not possibly satisfy the Western provinces, the Western themes. They began a struggle for the liberation of the Holy Sepulchre. By the way, Andrei, it's worth paying attention to where the Crusaders actually went, even according to the official version. Why were they so intent on storming Constantinople and not something else? The Crusades, in fact, were a struggle between the Eastern and Western themes for dominance across the territories of this unified empire.
If we speak in modern terms, not about Eastern and Western themes but about present-day states, who were these sides?
Apparently, one could very roughly group together such states as Germany, Italy, and France.
On one side?
Yes, and on the other side, most likely, were the states located in Asia Minor, such as the so-called Nicaean Empire, and probably Russia, as well as the region that later became known as Turkey.
And what was this a battle for?
It wasn't a single battle, it was an entire cycle of bloody wars. Their collective name is the Trojan War. It was a series of wars that included the Crusades, the capture of Constantinople in 1204, and then its recapture in 1261. Altogether, it was a kind of world war of the early Middle Ages. It was called the Trojan War.
Excuse me, but what about the story of Helen?
That doesn't contradict anything.
The idea that the Trojan War was fought over a woman is just a beautiful myth? That's what all the textbooks say. According to your hypothesis, that wasn't the case?
Yes, any war is a confrontation over certain resources, above all, the most valuable and universal one: territory with its population. That's what it was really about.
But the pretext for the war was.
The pretext for a war could be the assassination of an Austrian archduke.
So, according to your interpretation, the pretext for the Crusades, or the Trojan War, which, as it turns out, were one and the same, was the struggle for possession of the Holy Sepulchre?
Yes, by which was apparently meant the struggle for political and religious hegemony in what we might call the ecumene of that time.
And that's why the goal of that war was to seize Constantinople, since the Holy Sepulchre was located there.
Yes, absolutely. Constantinople was the political and religious center of the world back then. So naturally, it became the center of armed conflict.
Look, the Russia's revival is now winning.
That's very encouraging and very heartening.
So, how did it all end? How did the war end?
Throughout the 13th century, the war went on with mixed success. At certain stages, the West clearly dominated. At others, the balance tipped toward the East. As a result, when the scales leaned more toward the West, that was apparently the moment when the famous exodus of the Trojans began. The flight of the royal dynasty to various lands and provinces, including to Russia.
Let's take a call, since I have one more question for you about Russia. Go ahead.
Thank you. My question is this. How does this remarkable new chronology theory align with something that seems quite simple to me? The preserved biographies of rulers dating back to the most ancient times, from ancient Egypt, China, India, and so on. Their reigns have recorded beginnings and ends.
Tell me, please, how do you think the dating of those rulers' biographies is determined? How is it known that an ancient ruler was born at such and such a time and died at such and such a time?
All right, but let's take ancient Egyptian steles, for example, inscriptions on temples and so on. Were they made in the 15th century?
Where do you think the dating of the ancient Egyptian steles comes from? How do we know when they were erected? What's your own opinion?
I think, first of all, that physical analysis could show that, and second, historical context, because, I'm just asking, there's a certain number of ruler biographies from the most ancient times up to the 20th century.
I see.
Either they overlap with one another, or half, or a third of them simply never existed.
I see. Thank you very much. The reason I'm asking is that I've posed this same question to many people, and no one can answer it. It's taken as a given that a ruler was born at such and such a time. It's taken as a given that the Egyptian pyramids were built at such and such a time. How would you answer that question? Mine as well. Where do the dates come from?
As for the physical methods our viewer mentioned, we've already discussed that unfortunately, there are none at present. It so happens that there are no independent physical methods developed that could reliably determine when something actually occurred. As for the king lists, unfortunately, I don't have them on hand, but I could cite not one or two, but dozens, maybe even hundreds of quotations from the most respected historians and scholars of this and previous centuries. All of them lament the same thing, that in those ancient king lists, there is extraordinary confusion, with fantastic and real events all mixed together, making it extremely difficult to sort them out. As for the ancient Egyptian steles, I'd like to ask on my own behalf a question to the supporters of the traditional version. How in fact do you prove that a given stele truly belongs to a particular ancient Egyptian dynasty, and in which century it was erected? Who carved it and when? How exactly do you determine that? There's no need to appeal to the general historical pool or cite authorities. Specifically, how do you do it?
Do I understand correctly? Let me put it briefly, because it seems this needs to be repeated several times. It is impossible to determine dates by scientific, physical, or technical means. The dates are based on chronicles. The original chronicles do not exist. The chronicles were rewritten in the mid-17th century. Therefore, all dating comes from rewritten chronicles. Do I understand that correctly?
That's the first point. And the second, equally important fact, the histories of the most ancient civilizations, including ancient Egypt, the Sumerians, ancient China, and ancient India, were actually created much later. We must keep in mind that by that time the entire historical narrative had already been written, and these civilizations had to be fit into it somehow. Since all the known time had already been taken, arranged, and categorized, their histories were automatically pushed further into the past.
Now, I'd like to show the results of our interactive poll, and then ask you to comment on them, please.
That our time will be called a time of troubles in 21st century history textbooks, 76 people said that. That it will be called a time of revival, 90 people. And a time of boredom and despair, 16. Generally speaking, I'm really pleased that supporters of the view that our time will be seen as a time of revival are in the majority. That's probably even a kind of psychological turning point in the general mood.
I think that's very important, but there's another aspect. A time of troubles and a time of revival are two fundamentally different perspectives. If in the 21st century, this era is called a time of troubles, that's one story, but if it's called a time of Russia's revival, that's a completely different story. People are roughly divided in half, which once again proves that even while living in your own era, you can interpret it in completely different ways. Now we'll ask you a second question. I have to say this one is extremely serious, and your answer means a lot to us. In another broadcast, we probably wouldn't ask it, but judging by the letters and phone calls, our audience includes people who would be genuinely interested in reflecting on such a topic. Do you feel yourself part of the historical process? There are two possible answers, yes or no. I think this is also an important sociological question. We keep trying to understand why people are so interested in broadcasts dedicated to Fomenko's theory. Perhaps in the answer to this question lies the answer to that broader one. You were talking just now about the Trojan War, and the word Russia kept coming up. Are there any names of Russian historical figures who took part in the Trojan War on the side of Russia? Has anything like that survived?
Unfortunately, reconstructing the history of early Russia before the 14th century has turned out to be a very difficult task. Together with Anatoly Fomenko, Gleb Nosovsky, and several other researchers, we are now actively working in this area. It's hard to assert anything with certainty. We probably wouldn't even dare to make such claims now. But we can say one thing. Some representatives of the royal dynasty of Jerusalem Troy Constantinople who fled to Russia, did not accept the loss of their supreme power and continued their struggle for world domination. And there's an interesting point here. When working with various sources, perhaps fragmentary and incomplete, it still gives the impression that they viewed their right to rule the entire world as some kind of absolute, natural right of their royal dynasty. Their belief had a distinctly religious foundation.
Are there any names? Because when you say, the Trojan War, it sounds almost unbelievable. Are there any names of Roman, Constantinopolitan, or Russian rulers, or not?
I'm not sure I can tell you much right now, Andrei. That's because I myself am still in the process of studying this topic. It's very new. The book on the subject of reconstructing real history was literally finished just last week. We're now moving on to page planning and related work. We hope the book will be released in September.
Will it be a fundamental scientific study or a more simplified textbook?
Even the working title we use among ourselves now is precisely textbook. In other words, we've left all the evidence and argumentation in the earlier books, as well as in some others that will be reissued. And this one is really a textbook that presents our current vision of history.
It should come out in September?
That's what we're counting on, if circumstances are favorable.
Look how remarkable this is. Of course, this is an interactive poll among viewers who are interested in Fomenko, but the overwhelming majority feel themselves part of the historical process. 44 people so far. The voting is still ongoing, but honestly, I didn't expect that. I thought it would be 50-50. Well, we'll see.
I'd like to ask this question. It still seems to me that there are scientific methods for determining the dates of various objects. For example, the pyramids, when they were built. Or when archaeological excavations are done, there are fairly accurate methods. For example, the weathering method of the pyramids. We can roughly determine when an inscription was made on a pyramid. That's one. Second, in archaeology there are methods where, if a coin is found in a certain layer, everything else found in that layer is dated quite precisely relative to it. There are also other methods. When ancient fire pits are found, we know how various elements decay, their half-lives, radiological methods. So, I've always thought that you can determine dates quite accurately using different methods. Therefore, I'd like to ask, why do you make that claim?
I see. Thank you. That's a very serious question, because it actually challenges the very possibility of such a hypothesis, if our viewer is correct.
I see. We also used to think that there really were reliable physical and chemical methods.
Specifically, he mentioned the weathering method, stratigraphy, and radiological methods.
As for the weathering methods, no analyses or truly systematic studies based on empirical data and theoretical calculations have ever been conducted. It's simply assumed a priori that if they were, the results would confirm the accepted view. Personally, I'm deeply inclined to doubt that, especially when it comes to the pyramids. I'm an economist by training. Back in the Soviet days, we were taught very well to think in terms of resources. Any resource, human, material, natural, and so on. If you ask a simple question, how is it that the largest structures on our planet, the three Great Pyramids, with the Great Pyramid of Cheops alone weighing 5 million tons, as much as all the buildings in London's city district over an area of 2.5 square kilometers, were supposedly built at the very dawn of human civilization? At that time, every kind of resource, by definition, must have been minimal, from population size to construction skills and techniques. What kind of logic is that? That the greatest structures in human history were built first, and pyramid building then steadily declined? Because the pyramids that are said to have been built later, have either completely crumbled or nearly so. In any case, they can't compare with the three Great Pyramids in the quality of construction, material, or design. It's like saying the Industrial Revolution began with the Energia rocket, the Apollo moon landing, and the Blue Pacific supercomputer, and then slowly regressed to the Cherepanov steam locomotive and the Wright brothers airplane. Hard to believe, Andrei.
Illogical. And there were two more methods mentioned, stratigraphic and radiological.
As for the radiological methods, they're based on the half-life of elements. The most accurate one is the radiocarbon method, C14. Its calibration range is at best 1500 to 2000 years, even today. Others, like the radium or strontium methods, can date things up to 4 to 10,000 years. They're good if you need to date a pterodactyl or some horsetails and club mosses from the Paleozoic era. But when it comes to dating human civilization, which, as we believe, spans only about 1,000 years, or even if it's 5,000, it's still impossible to use these methods reliably. And so on. That's why, if anyone can point to an independent physical method that would let us determine the age of an object without any a priori connection to a historical era, we'd be thrilled to read such a systematic study. As for the coins, in one of our recent broadcasts, I don't remember if it was the last or the one before it, we talked about artifacts mentioned by ichthyologist Zaykovsky from Belarusia. In a Bronze Age burial mound, fragments of 18th century pottery were found, or in a mound from the time of Kievan Rus, 19th century coins were discovered in the eye sockets of a skull. How do official historians explain such facts?
We left off at the point where we were talking about the Crusades, also known as the Trojan War. How did it end?
That time, as in all other encounters between East and West, things ended unfavorably for the West. A branch of the royal dynasty of Troy Constantinople fled to the Vladimir Suzdal Russia, with its center in Rostov the Great, apparently the capital at that time, and began a struggle for world domination. Of all the Trojans who fled from Troy, only they managed to build a powerful, multi-ethnic state with a strong military potential. The unification processes across Russia continued through the second half of the 13th century. In the early 14th century, this process was completed by Genghis Khan, known, as we've mentioned, as Grand Prince Grigory Danilovich, and his brother Ivan Danilovich Kalita, also known as Batu. The East struck back with a decisive blow. This was the famous Mongol invasion.
You're describing it as if it's completely self-evident. So, Batu Khan was the leader of the East, marching westward and victorious.
Exactly right.
Got it. We've got about 4 minutes left, so we should take a call and then wrap up the interactive poll. Let's take the call first.
Good evening. I'd like to ask a lot of questions, but unfortunately there's not much time. If Russia was Tartary, and the Cossacks were called Tatars, then who are today's Tatars with their language and culture? And when did they start being called Tatars?
Excellent. Thank you very much for that question. First, very briefly, regarding the Cossacks. Traditional history has long held, and I think still does, that the Cossacks were descendants of runaway serfs. In plain Russian, that would mean descendants of roving gangs, medieval bandits, so to speak. Nothing of the sort. The Cossacks were descendants of the military estate, of the horde, in other words, of the army of ancient Russia. As for the Tatars, unfortunately, we're short on time, so perhaps in the next broadcast. But, Andrei, let me read a short quotation.
You've got a minute.
Understood. A foreign ambassador once asked our diplomat Grigory Mikulin, "How do things stand now between your great sovereign and the Tatars?" This was in the early 17th century. The reply: "Which Tatars do you mean? Many Muslim kings and princes serve our great sovereign, His Imperial Majesty, and many Tatars too, the people of the Kazan, Astrakhan, and Siberian realms, and of the Cossack and Kalmyk hordes, and of many other hordes. And the Nogayas beyond the Volga, and those of Kazis-Ulus are in direct servitude." From this text, and from many others like it, this being just one example, it follows that the term Tatars most likely referred to the Cossacks, meaning light cavalry, and only later, from Western Europe.
But where did the modern Tatars come from? That was the question.
The modern Tatars have always lived in their own region. They differ from us, only in that they are Muslim and Turkic speaking. That's all, speaking roughly.
We have to wrap up now. First, let's summarize the poll results. Thank you to everyone who called in. 63 people against 12 said they feel themselves part of the historical process. That shows our programs are needed, since viewers are interested in reflecting on the process they're part of. With that, I, host Andrei Maksimov, say goodbye.